So our next speaker is Professor Naman Ahuja. We have the great privilege of having him around because he's a very, very busy man. You know, he's teaching at Jawaharlal Nehru University, the famous JNU University in Delhi, and has also organized very, very big and important exhibitions in various museums in the world, and has this been thinking a lot about you know, the use of images, and today he's going to talk about political theft and vandalism of images in India. So we're carrying on with India now.
Thank you. It's a great honor and a privilege to be here, and thank you very much, Anne, for having been exceptionally patient with me over the past few months. I know I've been a bit hard to get, and my apologies. I feel like a bit of an interloper. I'm a curator of Indian art, and I specialize in art history. I come from a place, however, where I believe objects in museums are capable of carrying forward or displaying a discourse, which we were just asked about, on the vandalism of images and spolia. In today's paper, I'd like to consider 7 or 8 case studies of a variety of Indian sculptures which carry with them a history of violence. Sometimes these are sculptures which were just appropriated by somebody else or stolen, but very often they've been defaced and vandalized in acts of political rivalry. However blatant the violence is, when we look at the sculptures, there is seldom an explanation that is provided for it. Now, we are all used to seeing broken ancient sculptures in museums, and when the history of the breakage is not recorded, we are left to imagine what caused it. In the examples that I am going to show, from many that could have potentially been selected, they've been chosen to put forward an idea that it is possible for us to put a public discourse of political violence to put forward a public discourse on political violence. I'm also going to go further and say that when a public discourse on this is put forward, in India at least, we are told the violence is perpetrated by Muslims and Christians. And it can be shown that Buddhists, Hindu, Jain, male, or upper caste acts of violence are not talked about in museum displays. Although the research on the examples I will show reveals that it so easily can be. There is a tacit control of the narrative to perpetuate a certain self-perception. So this 8th to 10th century image of a female Jain seer from Unnao in Uttar Pradesh now lies ruthlessly decapitated in the Lucknow Museum. It can be interpreted in ways that suggest the beheading may have been done by those opposed to the idea of the canonization of a woman saint, rather than something perpetrated by an invading Muslim army. Like this sculpture, all Tirthankars are usually depicted in an impassive, cross-legged seated pose as if in deep meditation. Complete nudity, even without jewelry, is usually never seen on women in India. It is very common, however, with Jain Tirthankars. This may be a sculpture of the 19th Jain Tirthankar, Mallinath. Jains, as you all know, are divided into 2, Shvetambars and Digambars, and some Shvetambar traditions within India believe that Mallinath was female. Her straight back, the inflated chest, the gently carved breasts displaying her indrawn breath, that one plait falling on her back, and just one jasmine flower kept in her palm. The sculpture is exquisite. It comes from a period when we know of the rise of female figures as foci of worship across the Bhakti tradition in India, and this received a violent backlash. Mallinath's gender was changed. A story in myth was created that Mallinath was changed to a man, because it was only as a man that she could have achieved moksha or keval gyan. The best a woman could have done is to be reborn as a man when he could aspire to moksha. This female Mallinath could then have been beheaded by patriarchal Jain forces as much as by anyone else. From Kannauj, also in Uttar Pradesh, comes a sculpture of a goddess, perhaps Tara, the Buddhist Tara, or perhaps, although unlikely, the Vaishnav Lakshmi, that was turned around and made into Ardhanarishwar, the androgynous form of Shiva on its reverse. There is a substantial bibliography on Hindu-Buddhist image rivalries from this period that discuss how iconographies were developed of deities of one faith trampling over those of another, and on the takeover of Buddhist shrines by Shaivite groups, or the incorporation of Buddha as an incarnation of Vishnu. It's important to situate this sculpture within this larger history. It's very rare in Indian art to find a piece that is carved on both sides. Not only is it a double-sided image, the interesting thing about it is that on the one side where it is beautifully sculpted, it combines two gods in one. So the double metaphor seems to be writ all over this image in many ways. That double image is one of Ardhanarishwar, the sculptural body, the supernatural body, which is a metaphor for the cessation of duality, which is shown by combining the masculine and feminine form into one. The reverse of the sculpture shows a lady carrying a lotus. Now, although as scholars of iconography, we know that she is Tara, and therefore an image where a Buddhist shrine has been changed at some point into a Hindu one, I mean, that is absolutely clear if you see the attendant, which is cognizant of Tara. However, because a lotus can also be held in the hand of Bhudevi or Sri Devi, the Vaishnav consorts, I use the opportunity in an exhibition to raise doubt in the public's mind as a rhetorical question. Rather than being an example of Hindu sectarian rivalry with Buddhists, the sculpture could also be read to provide evidence for sectarian rivalry between the followers of Vishnu, whose shrine or goddess has been converted into Ardhanarishwar, which is something that would normally be there in a Shaivite temple. Has one deity been usurped by another, I asked. The opportunity was used to pose a third question about whether this is a double-sided image because the person who had commissioned the Tara never turned up to claim it, and the artist ended up reusing the stone, carving on its reverse, and offering it to somebody else as an Ardhanarishwar sculpture. In each case, the questions gave the audience an opportunity to become involved in a complex historical process. This is when discourse comes in. What happens to artworks? Under what conditions are they made? Who are its patrons? What might have been going on in the minds of those patrons and in that society at the time when the sculpture was made? Interestingly, this Ardhanarishwar sculpture was not one of those sculptures which was sent for exhibition to the Palais des Beaux-Arts in the Body in Indian Art exhibition. It was censored or stopped. No official reason was given to me. Neither was that Mallinath sculpture that I just showed you. Both were brought to Delhi from their respective museums to be put on the plane to be sent to Brussels for the exhibition, but at the last minute, both these sculptures were blocked. Now, no official reasons were put down on paper, but several sculptures, and these were not the only two, that may have given the public cause to reflect on political violence or overt matters of the politics of gender and sexuality, were blocked or censored by a committee that gives final approval for artwork being sent for international exhibitions. However, that committee does not have jurisdiction on exhibitions within India. And so when the exhibition was shown at the National Museum in Delhi, these sculptures were put on view there. The labels were allowed, And an 8-part television series, a documentary film series, was made in which these questions were posed to the public. The response was overwhelming. There are 3 Jain sculptures of Mahavir, Adinath, and Shantinath from Odisha in the Bhubaneswar Museum. They are often mistaken by the public as images of starving Buddhas. Close inspection reveals that what has emerged like rib-like protrusions on their torsos are in fact irregular grooves that have been created subsequent to the carving of the statues. Ironically, where Jain images exemplify ahimsa or non-violence, the torsos of these Jain Tirthankars have been used to grind or sharpen sickles and tools. Violence against Jains in the region of Odisha is known to have been perpetrated by Hindus. Could these images be proof of that? Or could they have been removed from worship by iconoclastic Muslims? The labels in the museum are anodyne. They don't inform the public about anything except the iconography, find spot, and date. Now, we were all brought up on that ethic of museology. We knew that it was not necessary to give too much information on a museum label because this is an art-going, sophisticated public. They don't want your long lectures. They want to see the art, and they don't want the label. But I think that's a little bit callous, and it can't really be allowed any longer. There are ways in which to be able to communicate a rich history alongside. This is just the same sculpture of Ajitnath, just seen in different photographs, where you can see how the surface has been used. And that's a Mahavir. Note the mark on the torso, which has been used to grind tools. Now, because I was intrigued by the weird grinding of these sculptures in the museum, I went to see if there were others in the site that they came from, Bhadrak. I found many more there. But most significant, the biggest one of the lot, the most significant one, has recently been stolen from the site about 2 years ago. The villagers went on complaining about their loss, and while I was interviewing them, something else emerged, which was fascinating. One thing became clear, that the grinding was not just of Jain statues, but of Hindu ones as well. Now, looking through the region, I was reminded of the rules of consecration in the Agamas, or rather deconsecration in the Agamas, which state that once an image is taken out of worship, if it is damaged for any reason, or if a patron donates a new image instead, the temple gives away the old images. It buries them in the ground, or they are released into the river. Now, would such valuable stone, which had been imported into Bhadrak, have just been wasted, or would the locals have used it for something else? And under what circumstances would they bring it back into use, and in what way could they use it? Once abandoned by their worshippers, were these statues used on the riverbank for grinding? I don't yet know for sure, but if I communicate my doubt effectively on the museum's labels, neither will the viewing public know. So to check my views, I undertook, as I was saying, this field trip to see what the villages there revealed. The material fits in well with the idea of the loss of sacred status, as we talk about in the deconsecration rituals in the Agamas. But I was reminded while I was there of a story of Ikkyu Sojun, the Buddhist Zen monk, who said that the sculpture of Buddha was just a piece of wood that could be burnt without sacrilege if one was dying in the cold. Several of you who are Japanese specialists would, of course, know that story. The story says something like he was freezing cold at night, and he took a wooden sculpture, and he started burning it. And his priest, who was his preceptor, came up to him and said that, "You're crazy, you're a madman, you're burning the Buddha." And he said to him, "But the Buddha within me was feeling cold." So what am I supposed to serve, the Buddha within me or this? And the priest apparently replied that he was mad and he was insane. And he says, you're burning the Buddha, you're burning the Buddha. So as the fire began to die out, he searched through the ashes. And then the priest says, well, what are you doing? He said, well, you said I'm burning the Buddha, so I'm looking for the Buddha's relics. I'm looking for his ashes, for his bones. And he says, well, you are a madman. This is only a wooden Buddha. He said, oh, very good. Now let's burn the other two because it's a freezing cold night. And so the economic necessity aspect, I think, is something that has to be brought back, because this kind of stone is not native to the region of Orissa. It was imported there. And I think these stories, as I was interviewing people, I went beyond whether the narrative of economic necessity, of reusing the stones to grind tools, could be given some space in the labels. Other images in the area seem to have been brought back into worship, as I was saying, only recently. Now, these sculptures, which have each got traces of grinding, so the Matrika sculpture there has a big slice through her head. These sculptures have all got traces of grinding on their sides, but they've recently been reinstated into worship. Curiously, when I was speaking to the families who called themselves the priests of these desecrated idols, turned out that they were upper-class Brahmins who had only recently migrated from Bengal, while the truly older temples of Bhadrak had new idols, but priests that were from their own community and were hereditary and had been there for generations. Clearly, the spolia was being gathered by people opportunistically to give themselves a new identity. So Jain sculptures were being used as Hindu ones, goddesses were being renamed and given new identities, but they were all old desecrated sculptures that had been invented anew. Not far from Bhadrak, at Soro in Mayurbhanj, is a shivling with a Buddhist inscription. Clearly, this was once a votive stupa that was reused in a Shaivite context. So the Yoni Peeth was added subsequently. You see, the examples of this sort of stuff are endless. There are so many examples that reveal the theft of temple icons by one Hindu king from the lands of another between the 7th and the 11th centuries. In fact, in his famous article on temple desecration in pre-modern India, Richard Eaton provides a series of examples of internecine warfare amongst various Hindu kings that saw the desecration of Hindu temples. I'll read a short paragraph out in which he provides a list, just to give you an example, and it's so succinct that I think it's just easier for me to read his list out. He says, in 642, according to local tradition, the Pallava king Narasimha Varman I looted the image of Ganesh from the Chalukyan capital of Vatapi. 50 years later, the armies of those same Chalukyas invaded North India and brought back to the Deccan what appear to be images of Ganga and Yamuna, looted from defeated powers over there. In the 8th century, Bengali troops sought revenge on King Lalitaditya by destroying what they thought was the image of Vishnu Vaikuntha, the state deity of Lalitaditya's kingdom in Kashmir. In the 9th century, the Rashtrakuta king, Govinda III, invaded and occupied Kanchipuram, which so intimidated the king of Sri Lanka that he sent Govinda several idols to represent the Sinhala state, and which the Rashtrakuta king then installed in a Shaiva temple in his capital. At about the same time, the Pandyan king also invaded Sri Lanka and took back to his capital a golden Buddha image that had been installed in the kingdom's jewel palace. In the early 10th century, the Pratihara king Herambapal seized a solid gold image of Vishnu Vaikuntha when he defeated the Shahi king of Kangra. By the mid-10th century, the Vaikuntha, which he had got, was taken by the Chandela king Yashovarman and installed in the Lakshman temple in Khajuraho. The same idol, we know, is moving around, and it's being stolen by one king and put into another temple and moving along. So as he continues, although the dominant pattern of looting royal temples and carrying off images of state deities, we also hear of Hindu kings engaging in the destruction of royal temples of their political adversaries. In the early 10th century, the Rashtrakuta monarch Indra III not only destroyed the temple of Kalapriya near Kalpa near the Yamuna river, patronized by the Rashtrakutas' deadly enemies, the Pratihars, but also took special delight in recording this fact in an inscription. The museum can therefore very justifiably start telling a richer discourse, a more layered history. As Upinder Singh and previously Ramila Thapar have both shown, Ashok may have perpetrated extreme political violence himself, and Ashokan pillars were later broken and reshaped at different places by different people. Both are important bits of information. Portions of the one, that's the pillar, found in Varanasi could have been destroyed by many different people at different times, for different reasons. Judging by the fate of the others gives us no clear answers. The one in Odisha became a Shivling. The one in Shug in Haryana became a victory pillar in Delhi's Firoz Shah Kotla, while the capital of the one at Bodh Gaya was never found. The temple at Bodh Gaya was, after all, burnt down, demolished, and rebuilt so many times. The pillar could have been razed to the ground by a rival group of Buddhists or Hindus, and if any remnants were there over a millennium later, perhaps they were subject to further changes by armies that were Muslim. The narrative that Hindu kings stole each other's idols has not been told enough in the public arena. Shaivs denounced Vaishnav temples and vice versa. The destruction of Buddhist sites by Hindus is documented aplenty, and Giovanni Verardi's recent book is a very good study of this. The exaggeration and even the falsehood of the usual claim that broken idols in India are a result of Islamic invasions has been exposed by several scholars in many nuanced ways, like Barry Flood, or by Richard Eaton, who I just mentioned, or by Alka Patel more recently. Museums are an important space to start displaying the evidence they house with greater care. And for this, the museums require greater protection. Evidence, after all, is not kept as poorly in a court of law as the neglect museums in India often find themselves in. The display and publication of historical paintings of the Prophet, for instance, was undertaken in 2013, especially as there was a major international controversy and threats after the publication of a Danish cartoon in 2008. They were woven into a larger narrative about how practice has moved against scripture. Again, bringing a dual message to the public, both equally important stories, and as a result, the museum director was emboldened to be able to display these paintings. There are, therefore, ways to be able to stage the discourse in the public sphere, to be able to use public instruments, to be able to tell such stories. By contrast, let's look at examples where a history of conflict has been declared. The presence of pillars from older Hindu temples are often spoken about at the Qutub Minar, but the opportunity to show another image alongside of a Vishnu now kept at the National Museum is lost. Found southeast of the Qutub Minar and dated by its inscription to 1147, that is about 4 decades after the creation of the Minar and the despoliation of the Hindu temples to build the mosque during the period of the Chauhan rule, this is an example that reveals the continuing Hindu presence in the area and fits so much better within our narrative of the opportunistic politics behind the vandalism of temples and the use of their wealth for political expediency rather than religious zeal. In fact, they all become examples of showing how religion became instrumentalized for the sake of political gain. Now, what can be more necessary than the display or the vocalization of that corrective in the narrative these days? And so, the British Museum now prominently displays in its refurbished permanent galleries on South Asia a panel from Gaur, Bengal, with a defaced Buddha on one side, with an Islamic mihrab on the other. The former carving is of the 900s, the latter of the 1400s. This sculpture, too, reveals, like at the Qutub Minar, how lotuses and Hindu and Buddhist Jain decorative ornament, no matter how symbolic, are absorbed into the ornamental vocabulary of the mihrab in Islamic contexts. It again clarifies that the problem for Muslims was limited to the use of spolia that would pass their own image regulations, the laws of their own image regulations, a continuation of a long-standing practice of usurping shrines and stones, and today also revealing to us how public institutions are now ready to start talking about historical conflict, spolia, and reuse. In another example, the body of an attendant to Shiva from Goa, and you can see there are many of these vetals which lie in the Archaeological Survey's collection in their storeroom, have been used as a slab over a well. The ropes of the buckets of water that have been rubbed against the body of these sculptures have cut deep into the sculpture. The image was taken from a Hindu temple during the Portuguese Inquisition in Goa. Without an understanding of the gods of India, they were widely regarded as being monstrous, their worshipped deemed worthy of punishment by death. Now, this is a lone example of a rich context with a label and an audio guide. Apportioning blame to one causative agent for the vandalism of sculptures in India is difficult. Each case must be read against the backdrop of the varied kinds of interests that would have seen to their restaging in new contexts or outright removal from public view. Apart from iconoclasm perpetrated in the name of upholding Islam, interreligious conflicts can be traced in India as much with Christian destructions of Hindu shrines or Hindu anxieties about the popularity of Jains and Buddhists. Other factors too emerge: the apathy toward and collusion of upper castes in the removal or reappropriation of lower caste or tribal shrines, as well as the requirements of patriarchal keepers of religions to remove feminist threats. These case studies point at more complex historical circumstances under which the theft of images and iconoclasm is perpetrated. In each case, they reveal how these acts are performed for the sake of a certain public propaganda that seeks demonstration of the usurping of somebody else's source of power. Staging this in a museum and openly talking about it within a long history nowadays may seek to remove the power this strategy has held for centuries. Why then has it been so suppressed? And what will it take to tell the history of conflict, of the nature of each community's inherited anxieties more openly? The chief instrument for all such political violence is, of course, well known to be the propaganda that is used to mobilize it, to justify it. The denial of the long history of the propaganda itself, how it has been mobilized, allows the public to remain susceptible to it. Perhaps then, the only solution is to stage and display the propaganda so that the public can see it for what it is. Apart from the people themselves, heritage and museums remain the most visible sign of political violence. The destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in 2001 emboldened extremists to further destroy more art and more heritage, Nimrud and Hatra, then Palmyra, the killing of the staff and the tourists at the Bardo Museum in Tunisia. They all bear testimony while countless Syrians are fleeing a devastating civil war. Its museums are also evacuating their treasured possessions out of the country. Even under mortal threat, the Museum of Palmyra was evacuated thanks to the efforts of Syria's Director General for Antiquities, Mamoun Abdul Karim. These efforts remind us of the similar efforts of salvaging sacred artifacts by those fleeing Tibet during the Chinese invasion. The Tibetan artifacts later formed the kernel of the Tibet Museum in Dharamshala. Now, these artifacts are still waiting repatriation, but repatriation where? To whom? To which state? The community itself having fled their homeland. So, moving away from ancient India, one sees that these examples are common at all places and at all times. There's always been a brutal politics of violence. And however much we abhor it, hate and conflict is normal. So the task then becomes, how is one to achieve that balance required in narrating it? Why can't we do more with that history? Museums of Indian art and Asian art on the whole are particularly resistant to moving away from telling anything but a history of religion through their displays of Indian artifacts. The usual problem of dividing galleries up into galleries of Buddhist art, Hindu art, and Islamic art really cannot be tolerated, should not be tolerated any longer. The same objects can permit a rich awareness of the violence that has been witnessed by the community, and not telling that history of violence consistently has allowed the culture to be typecast as having only been perpetrated by one community, the violence having been perpetrated by one community. What will protect the historian to be able to tell such a narrative? How will the space be made for it? The historian or curator can be perceived, unfortunately, as somebody who foments violence rather than peace. And this leads again to a suppression of the narrative. The only way forward seems to be able to use the museum to tell multiple sides of the story, to have a fuller narrative, and to understand that the museum label itself is an integral part of the discourse. Now, why am I writing this paper? Why am I here to talk to you about it? And why am I taking so much extra time? Just give me 5 minutes, and I'm coming up to an end. We hand out all these readings to our students, just some out of a flash of cards. There could be so many others that we keep talking about to them. I feel that because I work with museums, which as institutions have themselves come under attack, I find it is necessary to be able to embolden that museum and protect that space. I feel that it is possible, even in their brevity, for a label to be able to communicate a political discourse. Now, the question that Upinder asked very correctly is that, will this normalize violence, is the fear, by displaying it and by talking about it and bringing the discourse out. Not if we keep violence or the narrative of the consequences of violence and the narrative of ahimsa and non-violence as equally important spaces to be displayed in parallel, alongside. By explicating both views, the museum performs a more honest role. By potentially offending all and not some, it cannot be accused of being partisan. So, in my curatorial experience, I've found that dealing with an issue head-on allows emotionally difficult ideas to be accepted, and by addressing them and allows them to be addressed more comprehensively within a kind of a historical longue durée, robs it of the partisan nature of its common narrative. So, although, Anne, you said that it is rather trendy to be so comparativist, it has its advantages sometimes to be able to do certain things to mobilize that comparativism. So, for instance, this sculpture, a Kakatiya from the Kakatiya period, which I'm going to end with, this last display that I put forward, 3 images. A very graphic example of how violence is made normative for a society. A hero stone of a great warrior being celebrated by a community who has been deified not because of his dharma and his moral compulsions, but because of the violence that he perpetrated upon himself by going to war, makes him worthy of becoming a deity. So the public has a discourse to be able to celebrate political violence, as it were. His innards are spilling out. It was staged in a very clever way to be able to talk about martyrdom and jihad, and to be able to talk about religious martyrdom within a longer history, to be able to make the political compulsions of being able to see that religious martyrdom has a long history within each of our cultures. What was displayed alongside it was also the statue of a woman, also a female soldier in this case, shown killing herself from the same region made at about the same time. a narrative comes to the fore where violence is shown as being celebrated in history. Now, interestingly, when she is killed, she goes up to heaven and there are apsaras waiting for her, just as there are apsaras waiting for him, which brings other questions to the public's mind. But we ended the entire display as a trilogy, and we put forward that, which I hope will link with our next speaker on Pan-Asianism in some way. Placing the calendar print of martyrdom and violence as exonerated in the Indian freedom movement in the same exhibition was used to drive home another point that so clearly shows how a visual language of propaganda and mythology has become iconographic. And that iconography was adapted and used time after time. Now, this, after all, is proper art history and what a museum is meant to do, expose the vocabulary of visuality. The metadata helps in staging our dilemma, rather than working out a solution to it, and that is the more honest and participatory space. Can our discomfiture not be made public? It is worth considering, therefore, as you were saying, why it was necessary for Ashok to be able to offer a parallel narrative of being a peace lover. What compelled him, or his propagandists, to do so? Does the king who live on public taxes, as you see, feel that accountable? Does our condemnation or insult really have the power to injure them at all? I take your point, Upinder. It can, provided the spaces to speak are made available. Ultimately, this can only happen in the language of the people. And so I conclude in the 150th year of Gandhi with a lesson learnt from his shrewd understanding of propaganda and instilling moral compulsion. Where others bear Catholic guilt and judgment, we carry a deep-seated history of ahimsa and pluralism, which provide a kind of conscience. Efforts at changing those two are rife, and they must be staved off, for that would be the most unconscionable stance of all. But meanwhile, as a curator of a history in museums, we have to be able to call out a history of violence for what it was, rather than pretend it never happened. Thank you.